The late Roman city, beautiful temples, vast fora, more impressive and splendorous than even what many modern cities have to offer. A beautiful architectural style, lots of statues everywhere, often coated with gold, an incredible amount of classical art, many people walking through the streets, busy shop owners, rich aristocrats, then the huge baths, meeting place for thousands of people, unmatched in their grandiosity, then giant libraries, gargantuan theaters and amphitheaters. In short, when we think of the late Roman city, we think of the more positive aspects of Roman life back then. But was everything really so nice in late antiquity? Was the late Roman city really as beautiful as our sometimes romanticized glasses through which we see ancient Roman history would want to make us believe? When we see reconstructions of late Roman cities, then these are typically computer animations that focus on the buildings, on the urban structure itself. They help us to imagine how the buildings of a Roman city must have looked. Fittingly for our analysis of late Roman cities, most 3D reconstructions of ancient Rome are set in the year 320 AD, so already in the late Roman Empire. Why? Because that is actually when the city of Rome reached its greatest extent regarding urban development. This was actually when all the famous buildings had been completed. I talked about this fascinating notion in this video here. The Emperor Maxentius, in fact, unknown to many, was a prolific builder, and it was him who started the last great imperial building projects in Rome. The Basilica of Maxentius, the Temple of Romulus, a new hippodrome, and a mausoleum outside of the city. Of course, it was under Constantine that most of these structures were completed, and he took all the credit for building them. But when we see computer animations of ancient Rome or other Roman cities, we have to understand that these are idealized versions. Often we don't even see people, and we only have a focus on the positive aspects of the cities, namely the impressive buildings and imperial splendor. And indeed, this imperial splendor was in parts absolutely intact well into the late Roman Empire. For example, the city of Rome still appeared absolutely magnificent before the three sacks of the 5th century. If you would have walked through ancient Rome in 400 AD, all the imperial buildings were still standing, with all their beautiful ornamentation completely intact. On first glance, we would think that all was fine and well in the late Roman Empire, and thus the devastating events of the next 80 years might have taken us by surprise, had we not taken a closer look. But the same way as, for example, modern-day San Francisco sure looks nice from far away with its shiny glittering skyline, but if we look closer, then it does absolutely not look so nice anymore in quite a few places. Thus, when imagining late Roman cities, we should try to put down the romance glasses and try to imagine how life must have really been for the individual person. Let us start with the urban fabric, because in reality by 400 AD, everything was not as shiny anymore as you might believe on first sight. The temples, for example, these grandiose structures in which the old Greco-Roman gods had been worshipped for over 1,000 years, were ordered to be closed by the Christian emperors after Constantine. Especially after Theodosius, this had become permanent, and even though there would be tries to reverse this policy until even under the late Western Roman Emperor Anthemius, it never happened. And so these structures would slowly start to gather dust and to decay. We can imagine in many parts of the empire, especially on the fringes such as in Britannia, this process of decay started earlier and was much faster. In Londinium, for example, the old Greco-Roman temple in the central forum was by 400 AD a deserted ruin and was possibly not even standing anymore because it had been looted for building material. The same in Lutetia Parisiorum, modern-day Paris. The old central temple had been abandoned when the Alemanni threatened to sack the city in 260 AD and was reused for building material to build defensive walls. Already during the crisis of the 3rd century, many cities had in fact been partially or completely abandoned, especially on the fringes of the empire. The Agri Decumates were lost to the Alemanni already after 280 AD. The province of Dacia was evacuated by Aurelian himself, just to name a few. It was already during the crisis of the 3rd century that we would start to see more and more decay spreading through the Roman cities. Even in the biggest cities of the empire, this was a common occurrence. For example, early Christian fanatics had destroyed the magnificent temple of Serapis in Alexandria in 392 AD. In Constantinople, the old temples on the Agora of Byzantium were probably abandoned and left to decay by 400 AD. Even in Rome, the stronghold of the ancient worship, new churches were constructed with leftover material of old decaying Greco-Roman temples or other structures that had fallen into disrepair. Thus, the late Roman city was in reality already permeated with decay, which was spreading with ever-increasing speed. But even for the individual, late antiquity was often not a fun time anymore. But before we get to that, please like this video and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. Seriously, this channel would not work without our Patreon and YouTube members, and I want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form. Gratias tibiago, amici. And if you are a Rome nerd, and chances are high that you are if you're watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They have legionary rings, they have rings with different themes, they even have coins, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handmade stuff. There is really no better present for yourself or someone you know that might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with my link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. So the cities themselves were already starting to decay more and more, especially the old pagan structures. But there was also rampant disease. In reality, the Roman city had always been a population sink. The dense urban centers of imperial Rome, even in their prime, had seen more deaths than births. And the population of the big cities had to be constantly replenished with new people from the countryside, or else the populations of Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople, Antioch, and the other big cities of the empire would have completely collapsed in a few generations. That is because the hygiene back then was not highly developed, to put it mildly. So combine a high population density such as in Rome and Alexandria, which I have analyzed in these two videos here. Combine such an extremely high population density of 50,000 people per square kilometer or even more, with non-existent knowledge of the spread of pathogens, and you can imagine that diseases were a common occurrence. Pathogens could easily spread in Roman cities, especially the thermae were an incredible cesspool of many different viruses and bacteria. The water in the hot and cold water pools was not changed very often, and they did not contain chlorine as in modern pools. So all sorts of germs could easily multiply in the waters of the Roman baths. Consequently, going to the baths was almost a guarantee for getting some kind of disease. Or at the very least, one's immune system would have seen a lot of strain. That is why the great pandemics of the Roman Empire could happen so easily and why they spread so fast. Over the vast road network, people would travel regularly all across the empire, and the dense cities were a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and viruses. There were local outbursts even in the Roman Republic and early empire, but already in the 160s AD there was the first big pandemic. Then in the 250s, the second one, and then the plague of Justinian in the 540s, and so on and so forth. But even apart from these large outbreaks, there were time and time again local epidemics, also most often in the dense urban centers and not in the countryside. So the late Roman city was home to many pathogens, and thus many people constantly got sick in the cities and infected with all sorts of diseases, which greatly increased the chance of death. Then take injuries and infections on top, and we understand why the Roman city was always a net population drain. And then we have to imagine how insanely bad a dense city such as Rome or Constantinople must have smelled. There were public latrines all throughout the cities, and these, as we can imagine, were not really hygienic. Hygiene in general could only be practiced by the rich elites, who would, by the way, avoid the public latrines at all costs. There was no toilet paper in these latrines, and a kind of a sponge on a stick was shared, just imagine that, cleaned only superficially and then reused by another person. What better way to spread diseases than that? So therefore the latrines were only frequented by the lower classes who had no choice but to use them, because in the big Roman apartment buildings, the insulae, there were no toilets. The large domuses of the upper classes had their own running water and toilets, but the insulae, the many apartment buildings of the Roman cities, they did not offer such a luxury. But of course, sometimes when the people in these insulae really had to go to the toilet, they relieved themselves in pots and of course not seldomly emptied them onto the streets. Luckily, Rome had a sewage system, but even that could not magically remove the unwanted odors. Thus we can imagine how incredibly bad Rome or other late antique cities must have smelled. This must have been unbearable for our noses, which we of course cannot visualize in these beautiful 3D renderings of late antique Rome or late antique Constantinople. However, the smell probably varied greatly, since the large open spaces, the fora, did not contain public latrines, and the wind would gather more speed there to disperse the bad smells. In general, we can imagine that the poorer parts of the late Roman cities smelled a lot worse than the rich parts or the great imperial fora. And poorer parts of the cities there were a lot. Especially after the crisis of the 3rd century, after the quality of the Roman coins had deteriorated, after inflation had gotten out of hand, the gap between rich and poor had grown even wider, a phenomenon that we can relate to in these times of high inflation. So there certainly were more slums in the late Roman city of 400 AD than in the Roman city of Augustus or Trajan. There certainly were also more homeless people or beggars in the late Empire than in the early Empire. The economy was just not as good anymore as a few hundred years earlier, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand that this would have been visually quite apparent when walking through a late Roman city. But to make it even worse, the rich showed off their wealth in an ever more increasing frivolous manner, as described by Ammianus Marcellinus, the famous late Roman historian who lived in Rome during the last years of his life, so in the 390s AD, and described in a lively way the utter decadence that the rich were displaying wherever they could, in a most exaggerated manner. But at the same time, you would have seen the utter contrast to the beggars and homeless people, much more so than during the zenith of Rome. Thus, when we imagine the late Roman city, it is very tempting to imagine Rome as a beacon of light amidst the encroaching darkness of the Middle Ages, with its golden statues and temples of shining marble. But we should also, to get a full and realistic picture, imagine the late Roman city as it really was. Yes, there was still splendor. Yes, there was still imperial magnificence and beauty, but there was also decay, desolation, incredible poverty, and rampant disease and death. The late Roman city thus must have offered a very mixed picture. The contrasts were certainly much more pronounced than during the zenith of Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. So the next time we imagine the late Roman city, we should also imagine it filled with people, and with all the good and bad things that a high urban population density in a declining empire brings with it. And if you are interested in learning more about how exactly Rome looked during its peak, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in how magnificent Constantinople was during its zenith, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago, and bene valete.